So welcome to Managing Reactivity. This webinar is going to be focused around the topic of improving lunging and barking behaviors in pet dogs. So if you have a dog, probably do, that's why you're here, probably they've been lunging and barking at things. It's very broad, we're going to get into that. But the main thing I want to start off with is this starting point that often we're at when we start coming to things like this. And often it can be quite stressful to live with animals that have these big feelings and big behaviors, especially animals that have teeth. It can be scary sometimes. And lots of people come to us finding themselves having some really big feelings about this, which is totally normal and to be expected. Maybe it's frustration, or you're anxious yourself. Now your dog's anxiety is giving you anxiety and you're not sure what to do. Maybe you feel like stuck like in a loop with your dog's anxiety where it's not getting better. Maybe it's even getting worse over time. I really really appreciate the challenging position that you're in, because I was there myself with my dog Hera, and I'll be talking a little bit about Hera over the next hour or so. He is a 6-year-old poodle, and when I first got him 6 years ago, he was my first dog and I had no idea what I was doing. And he was a challenge. He barked and lunged and growled and snapped at all sorts of different things. And 6 years later, we have Calm Canine Academy, I guess, which is a company, which is a group of dog trainers who work to help especially complex, sensitive dogs in urban environments who are struggling with reactivity, aggression, and fear. If you haven't already, check out all of our free resources. Go to our Instagram, go to our YouTube, and learn more, because our big kind of mission is to make this stuff accessible and available for everyone. Because as we know, the dog training industry is unregulated. Like, anyone can get up and say that they're a dog trainer, and then they can do some really messed up stuff and can make it a lot worse. So we're trying to bring some nuance and some science-backed, kind behavior information to you guys. So check out our resources. Before we get started and start talking about the kind of steps out of this challenging position that I found myself in as well, don't worry, there are steps out. If you haven't met me before, just a quick intro. My name is Karishma War. I'm head of training at Calm Canine Academy, aforementioned CCA. I've been working now for 7 years. 7 years now. And I specialize in working with dogs who exhibit like quite scary behaviors, sometimes really difficult to manage behaviors, lunging, barking, biting behaviors. And we do it in a way that is science-backed, so based on evidence as much as possible, and also humane and ethical. So we will have a kind of do no harm attitude towards this, which I think every practitioner should. And today my goal is going to be to talk you through this one particularly important part of working and healing with a reactive dog, which is managing reactivity. I want to start off talking about how managing reactivity is important to healing from reactivity. And I'm going to start with just some boring definition stuff, so just hang with me for 2 seconds, because everyone here probably has very different presentations of this term reactivity. Your dogs are probably all really different, is what I'm saying. So let's just get some labels down so we're all on the same page. So what is reactivity is the first question. A very, very simple 3 steps definition. There are many different definitions. This is not the only one. This is just how I explain it. To me, reactivity is overreaction to everyday stimuli. So like this dog here barking at what looks to be some things around them. Maybe it's birds, maybe it's people, who knows. This sort of behavior is usually rooted in some big feelings of some sort, a need that's not being met. And our animals are very rarely like in control of their behavior, insofar as they're not doing it on purpose to get back at us. They're not trying to manipulate us. It often is a reaction, which is why we use this label of reactivity when discussing this behavior. Let's have a little look at things that trigger reactivity, and then I'll talk a little bit about the behaviors that we might be seeing, because that's just one example of a behavior that we might be seeing. Common triggers. This video makes me a bit dizzy. I'm going to play it anyway. You should be seeing like a kind of video of the city. This is, I think, Manhattan, which I know some people in the chat are from Manhattan. I worked in Manhattan for 4 years and now work in London. So big major cities are kind of my bread and butter, which are often the most challenging environments to do this, because common triggers are just everyday triggers. People, dogs, prey animals like pigeons or rats, or very common animals in the city or the country. Sounds, environments, vehicles, etc., etc., etc. It could be anything. It's just a maladaptive response to an everyday trigger. And the behaviors that you might see could be like that lunging and barking dog on the prior slide, but it could also be panicking, freezing, and being unable to move, getting really goofy and silly, and kind of like fawning. And again, like we'll categorize these behaviors under fight, flight, freeze, fawn behaviors, right? Because what's happening is the animals are having really big feelings, a physiological response is taking place, and their behaviors are usually an attempt to meet whatever need those big feelings have brought on. So for Hera, my dog, my poodle, he performed lunging and barking behaviors in lots of different contexts, but the big one was people. If he saw people, especially men, he would stare at them and then eventually lunge, growl, bite. He was also scared of the city and would panic and just pull at the end of the leash like a maniac and be unable to respond. He was also scared of noises in the home. He would bark. He barked up to like 50 or 60 times a day, having barking like fits up to 50 or 60 times a day when we were living in Brooklyn, because the noises in our like pre-war apartment building were just so loud that he was going crazy. Like he was really in a bad way. And I really had to dive into so many different resources to eventually make really good progress with him. I think that we use this word training all the time in dog training. You know, we're going to train the dog so they're not reactive, but it's not really training insofar as like you'd train for like a swim competition or a piano recital. It's more like therapy, it's more like healing, because we're talking about feelings, right? We're not like military style marching them around, training them to do things. We are trying to like heal some sort of like fundamental thing that's going wrong. And that's kind of complicated. So it's not going to be as simple as just like, we got to teach them to walk on a leash. Like, no, we're really dealing with like feelings, and animals, especially dogs, have rich and complex emotional lives, inner lives. We have a good amount of research and science talking about that, which I'm not going to go into today. And we need to have this holistic approach if we want to see success. So we know where we are, we know what our kind of behaviors, our triggers are, etc. And actually, if you're in the chat right now, or if you're watching right now, I'd love to know what your triggers are for your dogs, just to get an idea of like what's going on around, what have we got around the room here. These are kind of common categories that I put them in, just for like easy communication. Maybe you have something that's not on this list that your dog is triggered by. But I always like to see what we've got around the room. And then I want to talk a little bit about the path out of this. Like, how do we move forward with them? How do we heal from whatever it is that's going on? Let's have a little look at what we've got here. Lots of people saying other dogs, and dog reactivity to other dogs is very, very, very common. Everything, says Marie. So you might have a dog that's struggling with lots of different things, like Hera. I lovingly call that behavior bingo. You're like, bingo, I win. I get all the triggers. UPS trucks and like folks, delivery professionals often are triggers, because they often kind of come really close to the home repeatedly, and they're really easy to visually identify. We've got, you know, more noises, strangers, people, etc. It tracks with the general like kind of categories that we have here on the screen. It makes sense, which is good to see that we're all kind of communicating. And what we're really important, actually, looking at the chat right now, is that there are multiple triggers often from each dog. So it's not just, we're not talking about one thing, we're talking about multiple different things, and that's just an important point to think about, I guess, as we go through this. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about this healing process and what this healing process might look like. And the first thing that we need to be doing with these dogs, remembering that this is not really an obedience problem. This is not a problem of like defiance or the dog being dominant or the alpha. This is an emotional issue. The dog is having a big feeling, and our job is to change how our dogs feel about their triggers. We've identified their triggers. We've thought about the behaviors. Now we need to think about, ultimately, to get them feeling better, changing how they feel. And I love this little cartoon. I added the text because I don't think this cartoonist would have written this, what I wrote. Anyway, I added the text. You know, the fundamental issue with dogs is that lunge and bark at other dogs is not that they are disobedient or don't know how to walk well on leash. It's that they have a big feeling. Usually that's fear or frustration or some combination of those things. I'm so scared because I've been attacked before, because I lack confidence, or I really want to go and play with you. I'm so pissed off. You know, let me at him. I want to go play. I never get to play. It's so annoying. Those are the kind of experiences that they're having, and we need to change how they feel. Now, this is not, like I've said before, necessarily simple, but we've developed this framework for behavior and wellness called the HEAL framework, which overviews the kind of 4 big areas we need to be thinking about. So I'm not going to be going into all of them today, but just to give you an idea, lay the land a little bit for you. This is what we're going to have to be looking at to get your dogs changing how they feel and how they behave around these triggers. We need to look at the health of your dog, because lots of reactive behavior is just a symptom of an underlying medical problem. So we need to look and fully investigate that outside of the scope of today's webinar. But if you go to the CCA webinar library, we have an hour-long webinar called Pain and Behavior. Go and watch it if you have a reactive dog, please, every single person, because it is a huge component. Literally one quarter of the whole healing process for us is in this health area. So check that out. Exposure. This is the area we're going to be focusing on today. So managing exposure to triggers. Activity, meeting their needs, their breed specific needs, their exercise needs, etc. And then learning. We can teach them things. We can teach them new coping mechanisms. We can do therapy sessions with them where we can build good associations and build confidence, etc. But you can't just pick out one of these and use them. You have to really think about the whole picture and the animal as a whole, the body, you know, how much stress we're exposing them to, what their activities are like, and then what we're teaching them. The whole thing will apply. So if you've ever had recommendations from someone to, you know, if you have a dog that's lunging and barking, oh, just do this training exercise, absolutely not, because you can't just do one thing. Therapy has to be integrative. Otherwise, it might not be fair, because you might be trying to teach your dog something, but they're actually in pain, right? That kind of sucks. Anyway, we're going to focus today, which is new for me. I don't know if you've watched many of my webinars, but we're going to really zoom in today on the exposure piece. And this webinar is titled Managing Reactivity, and exposure here means managing exposure to triggers. Now I'm going to talk about this in a lot more depth. And I guess the first thing that I want to say about exposure is managing your dog's exposure to triggers is probably the first thing that we'll start talking to you about. And that's why our topic is on this today, because it's the first thing that we'll start with every single dog when they come to work with us in one of our programs. If we want to ever get our dogs out of this place where they see their triggers and have these big responses, we're going to have to change how they feel about the triggers, right? To do this, we will be doing careful training sessions or therapy sessions where we'll be teaching them to feel better, right? So this is an example of carefully controlled therapy session to help a dog that was reactive in a certain context feel better. So this little dog would be really fearful and panicking in the veterinary clinic. And over many weeks and months, they've been working on building good associations with the veterinary clinic. So going there, playing fun games, introducing veterinary equipment like this muzzle, and having it be a cooperative and collaborative process. This process this process often doesn't happen very quickly, right? I don't know if you've ever tried to change your own feelings about something or your dog's feelings about something, but it doesn't happen in like 2 or 3 repetitions, like 2 or 3 little attempts. Often the process of changing how our dogs feel about something takes weeks, months, sometimes years. That kind of makes sense, right? If you have a phobia, if you have like a big dysregulated response to something, maybe you have experienced that in your life. I certainly have. It will often take months to really move away from that behavioral pattern towards something else. Sometimes it even takes years, and that's not unusual. And when people ask me how long is it going to take to fix this, I have no idea, obviously, but it's not unusual for there to be a longer timeline associated. My 2 dogs, Ash and Hera, really did not get along. Both of them have dog aggression issues, and it's taken them about a year to be able to coexist. A year of us really not having them around each other that much at all. And that's normal sometimes for there to be like a significant learning curve for our animals. Now, while we are doing this behavior therapy, while we are going to therapy every week, we need to be careful, because repetition is habit forming. If we do something over and over again, that's going to become a habit. And this visual is always in my head, like neurons in your brain work like this, essentially. Really dumb, like not dumbing it down, but simplifying it massively. And I don't even know much about this, but it's something like the more that you kind of practice something, the stronger that kind of a line becomes. And it looks like this, like a desire path, right? So people have been walking through this field. It's created a pathway that's likely to go for the other people to go down. And now it's becoming this kind of habit. And this is what can happen with reactivity, essentially, if we're not careful. Because if we're not careful, our dogs are going to be triggered constantly. I'm looking through the chat here. We have people whose dogs are scared of noises, people passing the house, toddlers. How are we going to stop them from forming the habits of panicking in response to these triggers? And it comes down to this, that in order to heal and to change their behaviors, our dogs need to stop being triggered. And this is an example of me failing in this area. That's okay, because we're not perfect, it happens. And in this video, my dog Hera is really scared and he's frozen. Someone in the chat was mentioning this frozen behavior their dog exhibits. Well, he's having one of those moments where he's freezing in this urban environment that's just a little bit overwhelming for him. And it's subtle, but he's stiff, his tail is down, his muscles are braced. And for Hera, this is him quite stressed, he's frantically looking around. My goal for Hera is for him to feel really confident in all urban environments. Do we think that if he has these sorts of experiences frequently, I'm going to be able to get him there? That's a question that I didn't ask myself for a really long time as a dog trainer. I would keep bringing my dog out, Hera, into situations where he behaved like this or much worse. And I still expected him to improve his reactivity, and that's not possible. To heal, the dog needs to stop being repeatedly triggered. It makes sense, right? Because we're trying to change how they feel about something. And if we are trying to change how they feel about something and we're repeatedly pushing them in the deep end and they're panicking, they're just solidifying their assumption that that thing sucks and that they can't handle that thing. And the whole behavioral sequence is further strengthened, making it more likely for it to happen again. So it's so important that we shield them from things that they can't handle. And this often means making considerable accommodations for their mental health. And we really often have to change our behavior significantly to minimize them barking, to minimize them panicking throughout the day. And I think about it like this. Imagine that there's like a little temperature, what's it called, thermometer on top of your dog's heads. And whenever they enter that fight, flight, fawn, freeze, fidget, there are loads of different Fs. Whenever they enter that like panic state, where they're doing the lungy barky behaviors or the kind of like freezy behaviors, or maybe the bitey behaviors, whatever they're doing, imagine that thermometer is in the red. And our goal is to keep them in the green, maybe the orange. We want to avoid them going into the red. And my silly little ADHD brain really helps when I think about it like that, and I gamify it like that, so that we can really see like what we want to achieve. We want to achieve regulating their nervous system, regulating their sense of safety and comfort, so that they are practicing what we want them to practice. This is hard for many people, and making significant accommodations for your dogs can be really inconvenient and challenging as well. From like an executive functioning perspective, it can be a challenge. And I often get this question, you know, do I have to make all these changes? Can't they just get used to it? Like, won't they just get used to it? They have to just get used to it, right? Like, I'll just walk them and then they'll get used to it. Or I'll just, you know, have loads of guests over and they'll just get used to it eventually and be able to relax. Maybe, maybe. But if you're here, probably not, because you probably tried that and they probably didn't habituate, which is the term we use in behavior. Pardon me. They probably didn't habituate. And what that likely means is that it's going to get worse. So this method where we just expose them to things, we call it flooding. And sometimes it can work and the animal can habituate, but other times it can just trigger this spiral of things getting worse and worse and worse. And often, you know, in really bad cases, we see physical issues popping up as well as a result of this chronic stress that the dog gets in. And if you want to learn more about flooding, I'm not going to talk too much about it, but there's an article that I've linked here in the notes, and I'll be sending all these out to you, to everybody. So you'll be able to look at those yourselves and have a little look through when we send out all of the resources. And if you're watching the recording, it's just down below in the caption. So what have we got so far? We've got this general idea that we can move on, we can heal from reactivity, we can change our dog's behavior. It will involve multiple different areas of intervention. And then we focused in on this particularly important, especially at the beginning, intervention of exposure management, looking at why it's so important. Hopefully everyone can see why it's so pivotal in making behavioral progress, and why there's really no point in doing much like training until we've got this down. Otherwise, it's like 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. You're not making any progress because all of these bad experiences are just leaking in all over the place. So if you do feel a little overwhelmed by your dog's behavior, exposure management is probably one of the first things you're going to have to be looking into. It'll answer the questions, you know, how do we live with dogs who might have multiple months, multiple years of therapy to kind of see progress, or older dogs who might have medical issues that mean they won't be able to make behavioral progress. How do we manage that? How do we ensure their behaviors don't get worse over time through repetition, creating these like desire paths? And how do we provide a happy and healthy life for these dogs? Because their welfare is important. We want them to be happy. We want them to thrive, even if things aren't perfect, right? So that's what we're going to talk about next. We've talked about the why, and I want to give you some practical strategies. We're going to split this up into management in the home and then management on walks. So managing reactivity in the home is going to be where we start. And there are a few different triggers that your dogs could be struggling with, or scenarios that your dogs could be struggling with. Here are some common scenarios that we see people coming to our programs needing help to resolve. Sensitivity to noises, dogs like this little guy who's looking through the window and barking, maybe difficulty sleeping, resting because they're so hypervigilant. Really big triggers tend to be like doorbells and door knocks, and often people in the home as well can be a real source of challenging feelings for many dogs. I know many of you who are here have mentioned some of these, and I'm going to talk about 3 top management tips for reactivity in the home, and these should hopefully be quite broadly applicable, but let me know if you have any questions as I go through. So number 1 here is going to be window film. Window film is amazing. Window film, you can easily get it from Amazon. Sorry, capitalism. It's easy. Just do it. And you can you can spend $10 and get like a really big roll of this stuff that just peels off and goes onto your window, and it will frost the window. So you can have light coming into your house. You don't have to close the curtains because no one wants to be depressed. And if you rent, you can easily peel it off. It's so inexpensive. If you have a dog that's a window watcher, or a dog who intermittently barks at things come out of the window, animals, people, other dogs, do yourself a favor. Go and buy some of this and pop it up on the windows where they have access to. Small changes to their like environment can make a really, really big difference. So changing the like ability for them to look out of that window can be absolute game changer for many, many dogs, because the goal is that we have everybody's needs met. So they get to be free in the home, you get to have your light, but they're not going to be triggered every hour and kept in this like semi-guard dog mode. And, you know, maybe it would have been okay if you lived on like a farm in Ohio and like someone trundled past once a day. But if you're in an apartment and it's happening like 20 times a day, we're gonna have to work on this, because it's not going to be good for their mental health. So window film is going to be one. I've got confinement here, and especially confinement in a space where you can mask noises. So it's hard to mask noises in the whole home, but often keeping your dog in like an office with you or tethered next to you on the couch with the radio playing, especially during loud parts of the day, can make a really, really, really big difference. You often have to experiment with these things, you know, trying different types of noises to mask triggering sounds, experimenting with window film in different places. You know, maybe you put the window film up and then your dog learns how to climb up and look over it, and then you have to cut a new bit off. We've all been there, come on. So you're going to experiment a little bit and see what works and what doesn't. And it might be that the first few things you try doesn't really work particularly well for them, and you have to kind of experiment a little bit to see what works. That's totally normal. So changes to the environment that you can make, to the windows, to the soundscape, to their access to different areas, keeping them near you, keeping them away from noisy parts of the house, etc. Honestly, if you just do this consistently, you'll probably see a significant benefit in their behavior, because they're less chronically stressed over time, right? So until we do this, there's not really any point in trying to do training with the sounds. We do that. We do training to desensitize. We do training so that they can look out the window and not bark and not panic. But before this, we're not going to do any of that, because we've got to just get them out of that habit first, right? And then my last quick tip for managing reactivity in the home is around what happens when they do have reactions, because the reality is that you can't have a perfect watertight system in most homes. It's just not going to happen. So there are going to be some times where things happen, and the thank you protocol is usually what we use. And some people have mentioned it in the comments. Well, great, keep going. I'm going to tell folks a little bit about it if you haven't heard about this. The thing about the thank you protocol that I love so much is that you basically give the dog a cookie for barking, which sounds so wrong, but is actually so effective. So maybe someone knocks on the door and you weren't prepared for it, and the dog starts barking, buff, 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 buff. Essentially what you'll do with the thank you protocol is just say, thank you, thanks so much, that was so great. And then you walk away with them to a predetermined location. Usually I often will have like some cookies there, and I'll say, find it, and I'll like toss some treats for them to find. And I say treats, it can just be their food, like the food they eat throughout the day, or some scraps of leftovers, whatever it is. So they have the big emotional reaction, and then we say, thank you, we give them some cookies, and hopefully move on with our lives. When I first heard about this, I was like, okay, so you're giving them treats for barking. That means they'll bark more. Right? And that makes sense when you think about it that way, because it's reinforcing the barking. But actually what you're doing is you're kind of reinforcing the stopping of the barking. You're saying, okay, one bark's enough. Thanks. I get that you are genetically wired to bark at sounds around the home, but that's all you need to do. And now actually I want you to calm down and relax and redirect. and find this food and engage your nose, which will help calm your nervous system so that we don't end up in a place where you are frantic and unable to calm yourself down. So it's kind of like reaching out with support and nervous system regulating tools for them when something has happened in the environment, which is likely to cause them stress. Super, super helpful thing to think about. And also just like broader than that, to extrapolate and just know that you can reinforce animals after they do unwanted behaviors, if those unwanted behaviors are to do with big feelings. Right? Like if they're having big feelings of fear or anxiety and you give them a cookie that helps them regulate, you're actually just making them feel better about the original trigger because you're giving them a coping mechanism. So I don't want you to think like you have to wait for them to stop barking or something like that. You can go in and say, hey, baby, do you need help? Like, what do you need? And ultimately that will improve their behavior and their reaction to those similar triggers over the longer period of time. So we've got like environmental changes that you can make. We've got a reaction protocol. There are a few folks with some questions in the chat with specifics that are like a little bit more challenging that I think might be worth bringing up. So one thing that I don't have on this list here is for visitors in the home. Now, if you have dogs that struggle with visitors in the home, first of all, go to our Instagram and you can request, if you can't find it, our stranger danger guide. We have a guide on stranger danger, so dogs that struggle with people, and it gives you a lot more in-depth tools and tips and on this. So go to our Instagram, you can ask us for that, or you can find it in the guides. So the stranger danger guide. We have two options to manage stranger danger behaviors in the home. One is to put the dog away, and the other is not to have guests. Right? Because very frequently, if the dog's really unable to handle guests in the home, you don't want to be in a position where you're like holding them on a leash and they're lunging and barking at this person. We're going to either be managing where the dog is, or we're going to be managing just by not having guests in the home for that short period, or maybe you take the dog out for a walk while you have guests in the home. My favorite is to teach dogs to confine somewhere, to be okay in like a back room with the TV on so that you can have guests if needed. But that was a bit more of a specific one. And then we've got one question in the chat here, which is about dogs that struggle with people moving around the home, like the dog struggles with their own guardians and family members moving around the home, talking, etc. Now, when we're seeing stuff like this, number one, you're going to have to speak to a behavior professional, because there's likely something a little bit more complicated going on, to potentially something to do with the dog's medical status. So this is something that's going to possibly be outside the scope of this session. Do look at the pain and behavior webinar, though, and if you are seeing your dogs struggling with yourself, with the guardian, there's likely something that we need to look at that's medical. What if she barks at people and then comes over and calms down and starts licking at them? So if we're seeing dogs that are startling out of nowhere, like when they're startled by excess, like any movement, and then they're going, oh, sorry, didn't mean to, there's probably, I would be really looking for pain, for physical pain, being the underlying cause. So if we were looking at the HEAL framework at the health category here, and this is why it's helpful to be working with the professional. Sorry, let me take you back here. You'll be looking at this health category. This is not really something that you can manage the exposure to, because you have to exist in your home. We have to look deeper at the underlying kind of thing. This is why having a professional on your side can be really helpful, guys. This is what we do. Our job is to look at the patterns of your dog's behavior, identify where you need to be looking, and where you need to be investigating and intervening, and then guiding you in those interventions. And we do it all virtually, right? So I can see a pattern in this person's dog's behavior, startling at movements out of nowhere, and then coming back and being like, I'm sorry. To me, that screams, we need to go to the vet. We need to probably do a few different tests, et cetera. Maybe you wouldn't have thought that, but I'm a behavior professional, and the way that these things look in behavior and in patterns of behavior, it's different to what we expect very frequently. Anyway, I got mad sidetracked because that was a really interesting questions there. But hopefully you're getting the general gist here. With the behaviors that we're seeing in the home, we need to be thinking about like managing the space, minimizing their exposure to things that they can't handle, and then how do we react when they do have an overthreshold incident, etc. If you're seeing behavior towards yourselves, towards guardians, I guess the version of this would be around like the environmental control, maybe keeping the dogs in pens or in different rooms to the guardians, so that they have their own little space. And I see some people in the chat discussing that as a management option, and that's exactly what I'd be working on. So I'd be working on like the confinement part, the sound buffering, etc., and going there. Good question, guys. On walks, let's have a little think about the different ways that this can show up outside of the home. So dogs was a big one that we saw from folks in the chat. We saw people, children was one, scooters. These sorts of triggers are very, very, very common, and often much harder to like anticipate than stuff in the home, right? And you have no control over the neighbor's kid, or the delivery person who's like zooming around on the pavement on their scooter. So what are the things that we are going to be able to do here? The 3 quick tips that I have for you. Number 1 is to reduce walks. Now, not every single dog needs to have their walks reduced, but I do want to think about the way you walk your dogs, and is there something that we can do to reduce the stress that they're under? So that could be walking them at different times of the day where it's quieter. Maybe it means that you actually don't take them on walks every single day, multiple times a day. And I want to give you permission to do that. If you have a dog that's reactive, if you have a dog that is struggling with fear, especially, or fear-related behaviors, it's a blessing to not have to go into those environments and be around those triggers every day. I often find myself giving guardians permission to not walk their dogs every day. I'm like, walk them twice a week and drive out of the city and take them on 2 big walks, for example, instead of like 10 little walks throughout the day. Not everyone has the luxury to be able to do that. So if you can't actually leave the city to take your dogs on walks, instead, just let's get creative about how we can utilize urban spaces. So when I lived in New York with Hira, I would walk him in the Brooklyn Museum car park because it was the quietest place in my neighborhood. I would go to the Brooklyn Museum and go around the back to the car park and would have a sniffy walk in the car park because it was wide and quiet and not that many people were moving around in like a tight space. Lots of our clients will also utilize spaces like basketball courts, handball courts, abandoned children's playgrounds, or like empty children's playgrounds. I've got to say, be careful about the laws, make sure that you look things up, make sure that you're not being a menace. But there are many cities in which it's absolutely fine for dogs to be allowed in certain public cemeteries, for example. And I want you to get creative like that. Where can you go that's walking distance? And often in our programs, like Feisty Fido is our reactive dog program at the beginning, we spend the first week focusing on exposure stuff. And we get up our maps of our neighborhoods and we think, okay, where could we go? If we don't have a car, if we can't get access to like quiet, natural locations, how do we get to the nearest spot that could work? And sometimes we're going out there without our dogs and just double checking that it all looks good. Some people are saying parking lots, office buildings, exactly. Industrial centers, industrial areas, I find can be really helpful. Officey areas as well. Yeah. I've had clients in Manhattan take their dogs for walks within their high-rise building. Like they just go to a different floor of their high-rise building and go for a walk there instead of going outside because it's so much quieter in the high-rise than on the street on like 40 something and second, right? So I want you to know that it's okay to not walk your dogs as much as the internet says that you should. It's not about the distance covered. So it's not about going on like 1 mile walks over lots of different areas. Sometimes I take my sensitive dog, Hira, on a walk just up and down our block for 10 minutes. just up and down our block, the same block, or the quieter block that's like 30 seconds away from our block. And you don't have to cover ground. You can go on a short little up and down walk. The goal is for you to be predictable. We want it to be predictable and as stress-free as possible. So that's number one, guys. We're going to be managing our thinking about reducing our walks if we can, or maybe just rethinking how we're doing walks to reduce how overwhelming they can be for our dogs. The second thing here is a hard one, I think. For me, it's a hard one. Being prepared. It took a lot of experiences of me being unprepared and then shit hitting the fan for me to learn this lesson. But being prepared is so important. So what do I mean by being prepared? I mean having all the equipment that you need. Does your dog only eat chicken outside when they're stressed? You're going to be boiling up chicken. Or if your dog needs, you know, a big treat pouch full of something to get them through the half-an-hour walk, you're going to need to be prepared, you know, and think about how you can set yourself up for success here. And this is something we talk about a lot with our clients, because sometimes it's not about changing our dog's behaviors, it's about changing our behavior. And sometimes your coach and your trainer, their job is to help you treat prep twice a week and have those treats ready in the freezer so you can just put them in your pocket or your pouch or something like that. So being prepared, having the stuff you need is really, really important. And we will be there to nag you if you work with us about that, because you need it. But it's more than just having stuff. Preparation also involves like being present, like be prepared with your energy stores that you're going to turn up for your walk with your dog and be able to be present and there with them. You cannot be on your phone likely, especially not if you live somewhere like Manhattan or London or Miami or LA or somewhere that's busy. So you're going to have your stuff and get your shit together, but then you're also going to have to like get your shit together, like be there mentally, like with your dog, be looking around, because remember our goal is to reduce how frequently they're reacting to triggers, right? So you're going to have to be spotting for your triggers, looking around, and being perceptive of not just the environment, but also your dog's behavior and what that indicates. So someone's saying that in the chat here that sometimes their dog's like, it gives them the signals that they shouldn't walk them. And they say, no, okay, I'm not going to. Great. That's being prepared. That's being perceptive. That's being prepared to observe what you need to observe. So that's exactly what we're looking for. We're looking for you to be there and present, ready to make a new decision if you need to, and listen to your dog. And then, of course, dodge triggers. Dodge triggers. Distance is your friend. We're reducing or rethinking when we walk them, whether we cover distance or just explore small areas. And we're being prepared because we want to reduce how much they are lunging and barking. We don't want to have them go down those behavioral pathways over and over again and create stronger patterns of behavior like that. So distance is going to be key. This is a huge topic, right? Like how to dodge triggers is like the first 30% of Feisty Fido. Our program is all about dodging triggers and how to do it effectively and how to do it properly and at what distance you should be doing this. But think about it this way. The biggest mistake we see people making, other than missing medical stuff, and missing not getting the medical care needed, is that they're too close to the trigger. They're too close to the thing that's stressing the dogs out, and people feel a sense of urgency to like get the dogs around their triggers. And one of our trainers, Lauren, has a really good quote, or I don't know if this is her quote or maybe it's a famous quote, but she always says urgency is the enemy of progress, and that's 100% true. If you are really nervous and worried and anxious about getting your dog close and around triggers, that's not going to go well for you. You're going to need to switch. We're going to have to switch your perspective on that, because actually your first job is to be trying to get as far away from them as possible. You don't want to be thinking about them at all. And sometimes that means looking really weird and like 180, legging it in the other direction. Someone's in the chat here saying, I walked through sprinklers with my dogs yesterday to avoid several dogs. There you go. That's it. That's the stuff, right? The details of dodging triggers, we're not going to go into that today necessarily too much. I'm just going to look at the questions, I think, and dive into more detail there. But I want to give you the okay to move away from triggers, to give them as much space from triggers as possible. And if you work with the trainer, likely what they'll do is they'll have a look at your dog's triggers and they'll come up with an active management plan for you. So lots of the things that we're looking at today, they're quite passive, you know, like changing the equipment, changing where you're walking, white noise machines, these kinds of things. These are what we call passive management. So environmental changes, routine changes. What we haven't touched upon today is the active side. So the skills that you can teach your dog to help you manage triggers. I'd love to hear in the chat if there are any skills that you've taught your dogs that are particularly helpful. I'll see if we work with those similar skills. But if you are interested in learning more about those things and learning about, you know, how do I get from my dog being unable to eat to management past a trigger where they're able to eat and pay attention to me and ignore the trigger, that's something that we're going to be pushing you into working with us about, because honestly, there's only so much that we can do in sort of contexts like this. If you work with us, what we'll do is learn everything about your dog. We'll learn at what distance from what triggers they have different behaviors, what food they like, what toys they like, and then we'll come up with a plan for you, because the goal is to have a plan, to know what to do when you see triggers, to know how to handle it, and to be able to kind of manage the situation, right? Manage the situation. Without an exposure management plan, I think living with Hero was like stressful, it was unpredictable, it was a battle. And once I started getting a management plan in place, it became predictable for us and for him, which made it much more comfortable for us, which actually, without any therapy, massively improved his behavior. And most importantly for me and Hera, it was cooperative. We work with our dogs to help them move away from triggers, to help them avoid triggers. And some of you in the chat here talking about some cues, a flight cue to teach your dog to move away. That is something that we all work on in Feisty Fido. We get your dogs moving away from like bowls of chicken, which then translates to the dog in the distance. So things like flight cues, sniffing cues, searching cues like find it. Yes, these are all so good. Tricks can be a really helpful way to provide a positive distraction. Love this. This looks so good. Everyone, these skills are not unlike some of the introductory skills that we'd be doing in our programs. The thing that we offer is that application piece, right? Because often what we'll see is maybe you have some of the skills, but it's not being applied quite right. And that is hindering progress. Or maybe you're applying a bunch of the skills, but you're missing a key piece of the overarching framework. And I'll bring us back here to the overarching framework. And if you're in a position, just to end really quickly, and then I'll just pause and we'll go back to some questions. If you're in a position where you are kind of going through this presentation and you're like, wow, none of that is even going to help a little bit. My dog is so stressed and so triggered by so many things that this isn't even gonna like scratch the surface. That's also okay. I was there with Hera, honestly. And I'm going to suggest that you shoot us an email if you're in that position, because likely there's something complex going on, and likely it's something that will involve medical intervention to some degree. Someone's mentioned anxiety medications, and if we're in a situation where we have a dog that's so stressed that we can't even manage on a day-to-day basis, we're going to be talking to a vet about how we can bring them down to a more healthy baseline, because dogs who are being triggered, 5, 10 times, 20 times a day, even when you're trying really hard and doing all of this stuff, we're talking about actually really complex cases, and you need to speak to a professional. So I would love you to shoot us an email and we'll see if we can help you out there. But I thought that was worth mentioning because that was where I was at with Hira, and I needed a management plan, but I also needed to go to a vet. And I want to make sure I'm giving you a kind of balanced look at the path here. Great question here from Nancy. So I'll take a few more questions and we'll finish at 1:15. All right, my loves? So if you have any more, pop them in the chat and I'll go back and see if I've missed any. So a question from Nancy. Their dog struggles with people, runners mainly, or bikes approaching quickly with not enough time to react. Great question. So this comes back to this idea that, like, when we're working, you know what, should we do this? Yay. This comes back to this idea that when we're working outside of the home, we have no control over the triggers that can take place, and it can be fast. Like, a kid can run around the corner, a runner can come up from behind you really quickly, and it sometimes doesn't give you enough time to react. Listen, sometimes there are tips and tricks we can give you that will help increase the speed of your reactions, the skills that you and your dogs have so that you can react faster. But from my experience, a large proportion of the time in cases like this, where triggers are surprising you out of nowhere, we are going to be not walking them in those areas, or not walking them at all, or basically not putting yourself in the situation where that can occur, because we cannot account for everything. And sometimes you have to just cut your losses and say it's not worth it, because every time I try to take them on a long walk like that, we're getting surprised 3, 4, 5 times. And at the end, they're just hypervigilant and stressed and they're not recovering. We might decide to not, that might not be the best decision to continue walking your dogs in that scenario. So sometimes, quite frequently, more times than I would like, we do have to kind of go, okay, I see that I can't actually manage this situation, which means I'm going to set a boundary and remove myself from it and remove my dog from it and set that boundary for the dog, because they can't do it themselves. They have no control over anything. Good question. Okay. What to do when the dog is already reacting outside and cues or offering food are not helpful? Great question. So I guess this kind of goes back to this general idea that, like, sometimes people are like, oh, they only reacted twice on the walk, so it was fine overall. But to me, those 2 reactions were probably the worst times of your dog's day. So if we're seeing that you're walking your dog and, you know, you're managing most of the time, but just sometimes, you know, you get surprised and then they're so stressed they won't eat and they can't respond, I would probably be tracking that. Number one, how often is that happening? Is it happening every day, or is it just happening once a week, once every 2 weeks? Because if it's happening every day too frequently, again, I might be reconsidering, do we even need to walk this dog? Or are we walking the dog for too long? Or should we be taking them somewhere else to walk them? Basically, I'll really be reconsidering whether or not that's an option. Because sometimes what we're kind of, the trend I get in lots of questions here is that sometimes things are unmanageable. Sometimes you cannot manage it, and that's fine. But then we have to know when to say no, because if you can't handle it, we can't keep putting ourselves in those situations over and over again. That doesn't mean it's forever. It's a short-term thing. This management that we do is so that we can then get them, hopefully, if it's appropriate for that dog, back to be able to have those, the kind of freedom to do the things that we want to do with them. But it just can't happen straight away in many cases. And like, to all of these questions that I'm seeing about, like, even with the management, my dog is still barking and not responsive to food and unconsolable. In those cases, we're going to be zooming out of the exposure kind of quadrant, and we're going to zoom into the health quadrant. Because if your dogs are getting so triggered that there are physiological changes taking place, like they are breathing quickly or freezing or not eating and struggling to recover, they're probably, if that's happening frequently, they're probably in a chronic stress state. And animals that are in chronic stress states are often unable to learn. So until we get them out of that chronic stress state, we're not going to be able to manage anything. And that often involves medications to manage anxiety. What do you do when the scenario is so stressful and you can't make any more changes? If you can't control the external environment, we go internal and we control the internal environment of the dog's neurochemistry and physiology. So if we're in a situation where you're trying all of these management strategies, you've gone to a trainer, you've really exhausted all of the options, none of it's working, the dog's still chronically stressed, we're going to be going to a vet. And that's something that we are very, very good at advising you in. When should you go to a vet? What vet should you go to? What should we be discussing with them, etc.? These are things that we help you with because it can be a challenge for sure. Got a few more great questions here. Oh my God, what a good question. Oh, I love this one. Okay. My dog won't react if the walker is walking him, but when I hold the leash, he reacts a lot. I wonder if I'm making him stress. Someone says, is it owner guarding? Does the dog's reactivity have something to do with us? There are a few different things that could be going on here. Sorry, I'm excited. This is a good question. There are a few different things that could be going on here. Number one, it could be some sort of learned behavior to do with the guardian's behavior. And I would want to see videos and watch you walking your dog and see if I notice any body language that will give us any more information. So it could be something to do with, like, you know, maybe you tense up, which makes your dog tense up. But there's this narrative from lots of training professionals about how it's all the guardian's fault and, you know, they're making the dog reactive, when actually quite frequently what I see is that when our dogs are with us, they feel safe and they often express their needs in big ways. We see it with kids quite a lot as well. They express their needs in bigger ways than they would with the dog walker. Now, I'm not saying that the dog walker is mean to your dog or anything like that, but the dog walker just might be less responsive. So the dogs learn to not try and kind of give up. That doesn't necessarily mean that the dog is fine. So what I always do is, if I have someone who's saying my dog's fine in this context but not fine in the other context, I want to see videos, show me it, show me the money, I want to see what it looks like. Because very frequently I'll look at the dog walker's video and the dog will be walking like this. That dog is not fine. Like, that dog is just like holding it together, you know. Or this happens at the groomers, you know, oh, they were fine at the vet, but when I'm there, they're really stressed. Are they fine or are they frozen? And if you had a heart rate monitor on them, would it be right? Subtle signs of stress go missed by animal professionals so frequently. So I would always be thinking that a little bit in my head if I am seeing very different behaviors in different contexts. But it was a great question. Oh, I've got some really nice questions in here. I'm going to hang out and answer more of them. All right, so this is something that I struggled with. This dog is like, this person's talking about struggling to meet their dog's needs at the same time navigating their reactivity to people. So you're trying to let your dog run off leash at the beach, but sometimes he just goes towards people and then starts barking. Should I never let him be off leash in the park, is the question. The answer is yes. Dogs that lunge and bark at people, other dogs, should never be off leash, ever, ever, ever. Because we have very little control of what can happen in the environment around us, and very quickly things can go wrong, especially if your dog is under 5 years old, because a lot of change takes place between the age of 6 months and 5 years old. So your dog might never have done XYZ before, but they might. So rather than never ever having them outdoors and off leash, maybe we try somewhere in the middle. Maybe we take them to quiet places, or we only go to the beach really early in the morning so there are less people around, and then we use a long line, like a long leash, like 30-foot leash, so that they have some freedom of movement. But if they do get triggered and run off, you can help and make sure that they don't get too close. So sometimes working with a professional can help get that perspective, because it's hard when you're in it, you know. I have a dog trainer to help me make good decisions about my dogs, right? Because it's hard when you're in the middle of it. So from a safety perspective, not something I've discussed too much because we've not been talking much about aggression, just mostly like reactivity. But in general, we don't want these dogs off leash. We want to be being prepared by being observant of the environment for people who might be around us, and then having that long line on them so that if anything does happen, we can just pick it up. Now, I don't say that I make mistakes too. I've been caught out as well in my time, and I've learned the hard way that, trust me, you want to be there. You want to be prepared with your kit because it will really help you. It'll really, really help you. Got some folks talking about stranger-related fear and dogs that are really struggling to be introduced to new people. Outside the scope of today's talk, but I would look at our stranger danger program, because we have a program all about introducing dogs to new people. So you can just jump on our website and find that under the group programs section. All right, I'm going to do one last question, and then I'm going to finish up for today, which is a question around how much we should manage in terms of their behavior. So this person's dog used to lunge and bark, but now they just stare, and they stare and fixate at the dogs as they walk past. Is that allowed? Is what they're saying. Should I manage? Should I manage that? The answer is absolutely yes, you should manage that. And it will take us back to dodging triggers. And by dodging, I don't just mean skirting around the edge of triggers. I mean literally GTFO, like get out of there. Like, you're moving, you're hustling, your dog's butt, you want your dog's butt pointed at the trigger, face pointed away from the trigger. If they're staring them down, what do you think's going on in their head in that moment? They're going, you know, they're having a big response, and we need to manage their feelings as much as their behavior. Your dog might not be lunging and barking anymore, but the feelings were probably still there. So not skirting around the trigger, GTFO, get the fuck out of there. Distance is your friend, dodge those triggers. Like, I think about like the ghosts in Pac-Man. Have you ever played Pac-Man? The little ghosts chase you and you have to go like, ah, and run away. Like, that's what we're looking for. Really distance. 100% distance. All right. I'm going to finish up. It was so nice to chat to everybody. I hope that you enjoyed this. I had a great time. We were just about an hour. So I want to finish up by seeing your dogs. Can I see them? Can I see them, please? I just talked for an hour. Show me doggies. Oh my goodness. Look at this one. Look at this one's flat like a pancake. Oh goodness. Oh, look at these. I bet these toes smell really good. Hello. Oh, distinguished. Look at this guy.